All right, today we're talking about dual agency, and I want to start by not dual agency, we're talking about buyer representation, which could involve dual agency, and some of the tools and things that I prepared and resources and collected that might help you with that. A question which sometimes comes up is if you're the listing agent, what do you do if you have what's called an unrepresented buyer? And that's a useful topic because on the listing side to think about. So how would this normally come up and why would it be more prevalent now than it was prior to the National Association of Realtors settlement? And the reason is that you might have a buyer who says, if I don't have my own agent and I'm working directly with the listing agent, then there's no fee to be paid to my agent, which means I'll be in a stronger bargaining position with the seller because I'm not going to have an agent who's going to be compensated. I don't have to pay them. The seller doesn't have to pay them. That's going to make my offer stronger. Now, there would be actually two potential ways in which that could manifest. One would be dual agency. And this is where the listing agent says, I'm not only going to represent the seller as an agent, I'm going to represent the buyer as an agent. That is unlikely to be the case most of the time for a couple of issues. Number one is that the dual agency creates a split kind of fiduciary duty, and it's very hard to carry water on both shoulders. And it increases agents' legal liability because if somebody sues and you're a dual agent, you've already got points against you when it comes to being in court. And the other issue besides legal, and by the way, even prior to the NAR settlement, there are a lot of listing agents that would not do dual agency. They would not represent the buyer because they didn't want to have to get a lawyer and they didn't want to have to go to court, right? And so they just don't do it. So then the buyer says, well, look, I don't want, and the other issue with dual agency is, do you expect to be compensated for representing the buyer in the transaction? Now, if the answer is yes, this becomes way more complicated because you would need a buyer representation agreement saying you're representing the buyer, which would have to mention compensation. And the whole reason the buyer was being unrepresented is so that they don't have to pay a compensation to the list to an agent representing them. So then comes the unrepresented buyer. And the unrepresented buyer says, look, I don't need an agent. You can help me fill out the paperwork. I don't want an agent. I don't want to pay an agent. So if you're the listing agent, the thought is, should you be compensated if you have to do all the work for the buyer's agent? Should you be compensated? And there's a form that NAR put out. It's like a flyer, and it has 105 things that a buyer agent does for the buyer, which I would show to a seller and say, look at all these things that I'm going to end up doing. I'm going to have to write the offer. I'm going to have to explain this. I'm going to have to do all this stuff. I'm going to have to manage that part of the transaction. So because there's extra work, I expect to be compensated. Now, the seller has a choice here. The seller could say, I don't want unrepresented buyers. One of the statistics that's all over the internet is that 71% of all lawsuits involving real estate transactions are involved when there's only one agent in the transaction. So if the buyer is unrepresented and the buyer buys the property and later finds something they don't like and sues, then there is, first of all, a greater chance that they're going to sue because nobody was explaining stuff, nobody was helping them, right? So, they're more likely to sue. They'll say, I never had an agent, I never had a chance, I never understood it, right? So the seller might say, I don't want unrepresented buyers. Tell that buyer to get an agent if they want to buy the property. That's an option. The other option is the seller could compensate the listing agent something if the listing agent helps the buyer write the contract and manages the transaction from the buyer side. How much? Well, I've seen a spread from the low being $1,000 to the high being 2.5%. I've seen that spread with listings already, where basically the listing agent is saying, if I have to do all the work for the buyer, I want 2.5%, and in addition to the listing commission, down to where for $1,000 I'll have the buyer fill out the forms. And I even think we do have one where they just didn't check the box at all, and they basically the seller was saying, well, let's see if this comes up. We can talk about it then. Any questions about that? All right. Well. All right. So what I wanted to share today, and I'll put it in the chat. So that means somebody who wants to be helpful and make a copy of it. So when people keep joining, which is likely to happen, and they say, how do I get a copy of the handout? Then you could be the hero and put it in, right? Isn't that right? So that's it. I hope it opens. And this is what it looks like, assuming it opens. So I've made videos. I'm going to make more videos because why not? I got nothing else to do. And what I would recommend is that you create a shortcut in Google Drive, in a Google Drive folder, rather than just making a copy of this. You see, you could go up and go to File and make a copy, but then if I add things, change things, you're not going to have the additions or changes. If you go down to add a shortcut, then it'll put what looks kind of like a document in your drive, but whenever you click on it, it's going to be opening up this actual document. So if I add something or change something, it'll be there, right? Now, the first thing that I would strongly recommend is that you print out copies of some of these forms to carry with you. Put them in your car, more than one, several copies. Now, in doing that, my suggestion is to use the EXP buyer representation agreements. There are two of them. One of them is the EXP agreement, which is for a single property, and one of them is for all of the different properties. And I don't see that link here. Is that right? Is the link not there? It's signed BRBC, buyer rep packages. Let me see.
Mike, can you share your
Is my screen not being shared? I didn't know that. Sorry about that. Thank you for mentioning that. All right. So this document here, which I'm going to reword it a little bit. This document here is I'll put it up here. All right. I wanted to shout that part out. All right. See, this is why it's better to make a shortcut. And we're going to add the link. Okay. And I believe in the individual forms, I've already got this, but you'll see what I mean. So if you open up that folder, you're going to see these are the first two are EXP. And what I'm going to do is just select. And there's two EXP forms. One of them is a single property form, and one of them is the buyer broker form, which is a general form. Now, what I believe we've done is we've created by we, I mean raw, for each of the different regions of EXP, a PDF of the forms. So let's say I picked up the single property form, there's the fair housing, and this isn't all the forms. I'm sorry. This isn't the right folder, I don't think. But well, I'm unhappy with that. Just a second. So this is going smoothly. Let me I've shared them before, but just let me. Oh. So anyhow, I don't think I'm going to put this on YouTube. Let's go through it again. So we have prepared them someplace, and I'll find it in the right place. So what we've done, but I can't find them right away, is we've taken the forms that are connected to the buyer representation agreements. That means agency disclosure. It means the buyer representation agreement. There's fair housing, there's PRBS, there's the broker compensation advisory, the broker inspection advisory, and also there's the California privacy. And what we've done is we've bundled them together, right? And I had thought they were here, but I don't see them here. So maybe this is where they are. Let me just see. This is the way. Yes, so here they are. Let me just move these into that other folder, the one that I've shared with you. And anyhow, so these are just the general forms. These aren't the single property forms. You're going to have to give me a few minutes in order to fix that. But if you look at it, what we've done, and this wasn't an easy thing to do because the California Association of Realtors and SkySlope make it difficult for you to print out a blank form. But we've managed to do it, and this is a set with the EXP form. So what you would do is you would print them out and you would carry them with you. And then you would check the box buyer, assuming there more than one, you'd check both boxes. You'd have to write in your information or type it using a PDF editor in advance. Then here's fair housing. And then I would have rearranged these. I'm going to make sure that these are all rearranged because the buyer broker one should come up before or just after the agency disclosure. But you would, so we're going to rearrange the form so that they make a little bit more sense. But let me just explain at this point what the goal is. Let's say you're meeting people at a coffee shop and I'm going to stop sharing this so I can. You're meeting people at a coffee shop or you're meeting them at a house because they want to tour property. You need to get a buyer representation agreement signed. Now, EXP wants agency. In fact, the California Civil Code says first you ought to do the agency disclosure, right? Before you do anything else, before your relationship with the buyer becomes more than transitory in nature. So we need agency disclosure. We also need the buyer representation agreement. Now, I've pushed the brokers at California at EXP with the question, if we did those two forms, would you be happy? Right? And they said, no, we want all the forms, right? Which means they want, in addition to the buyer representation agreement and agency disclosure, they want all of the other forms, which is the fair housing, the privacy, et cetera, right? They want it. So if we print them out and we're sitting there talking to somebody and they're like, yeah, okay, let's do it. You could, with a pen or even a stubby pencil, fill out the forms and get them to sign. Is everybody with me? Now, could it be done electric e-signing? The answer is yes. But then that sometimes gives people, it sometimes gives people an excuse not to sign the forms at this time, right? Because they'll say, okay, we'll send it to us and we'll look them over and that sort of thing. If somebody's ready to sign, it would be good to get them to sign right now. So once you've done that, all right, so let's assume that they're ready to go. We've got them to sign the forms. All right. Now, the Business and Professions Code says that if you're a real estate agent and you get somebody to sign forms, you're supposed to give them a copy at the time they sign, which brings us to another part of this, right? And we do have packages, and they will be in the right order. Just give us a few minutes after this class is over, and I'll update the folder. But there are two possible things to do when you're going to give somebody a signed copy of the forms. One, which is really medieval, old school, is you take 2 copies of the forms, fill them out, and identically, and everybody signs both copies. 1 copy the clients get, 1 copy you get. Right now, you've given them a copy and you have a copy. The other, what I do is I use my phone to scan the documents. The 2 programs that I would recommend, which are both free, one is Adobe Scan and the other one is Microsoft Lens. I use Microsoft Lens myself. Personally, I use Microsoft Lens. And so Microsoft Lens and Adobe, they're really good at scanning documents. It identifies the 4 corners. You can scan multiple documents. You could do, there really isn't any limit. It works very quickly. And when you're done, it'll convert it into a PDF, which you could then email the client, here's your copy, right? Doesn't take very long. But if you're going, you ought to be prepared to get people to sign the documents, wet signatures, copies that you carry with you. It's going to come up if you're showing properties and doing open houses. I'm just saying, it's going to come up. Now, the second option would be to do it by e-sign, and there are 2 e-sign options. One is using the California Association of Realtors BRBC forms. This is a harder one to make you can print it out copy because CAR goes to great lengths to make it difficult for you to download a blank form. What we have to do is actually type in on the form, then download it, and using an editing program, delete the stuff that was typed in. It's time consuming, but if you're doing electronic signatures and you want to keep your learning tech at a low bar, the easiest thing to do is to use the California Association of Realtors forms and fill it out and send it to the buyers for signatures on ZipForms. Now you'll see I've included a link to ZipForm Mobile, which is a free app you can download. So what I do like, for example, later today, I'm going to go talk to somebody about selling their house in Morgan Hill. In advance, I'm going to prep all of the forms in ZipForms so that when I get there, all I have to do is pull up ZipForms Mobile. We can talk about certain aspects. What is the price? How long is the listing? What is the commission? We could fill it out, right? Add in those things, but everything else is filled out. The same concept works with the BRBC. So in ZipForms, in advance, you would have your template, and the video I made explains how to do that. I've also made a video. This video here explains how to go through the process of getting people to sign the CAR forms. This video walks through the BRBC form, explaining how to fill it out. And if you've done that in as much as possible in advance, it's easy if you're sitting across from somebody in ZipForms mobile to just email them the forms for e-signature. Of course, it would work better if you knew their names and their email addresses, and you already had that in ZipForms. I've included a tutorial on buyer representation, and some of these are cross-linked. So, and some of this is what you may have seen before, but I created what I consider to be a short version of the buyer representation, and it just goes through some things. In here, I had put in, and read this paragraph, how much commission are you interested in? And you could delete that. You could not say anything at this point about the commission, but what I had suggested was 2.5%. And also, if it's something that's off market, that we had defined 3%, and if it's a new home build, 2%. But that's something you can modify. You could even delete any reference to it. So there's a short version of the buyer representation. This is a Google slide, so you can modify it. There's a long version, which is a much more involved presentation. I've also, and I know there are a lot of forms, I realize this. I'm confused, but there's also a form called the PSRA, which is the Property Showing and Representation Agreement, which is a CAR form that you would use if you don't have a very strong rapport with the buyers. And that form is designed to show 3 properties. And I made a video, and one of the things that I point out in the video is that even though that form has a list for 3 properties, and even though it says it's intended for 3 properties, it doesn't have to be for 3 properties. So let's say they say, well, we're willing to make a deal with you where you can show us property this weekend, you can show us property on Sunday. If we buy any of the properties you show us, then yes, we will sign your buyer representation agreement. But at this point, we don't want to make a commitment to work with you for 30 days or 60 days or anything like that. We don't want to do that. So you could say, great, I'm going to identify the properties. We're going to come up with the list that we're going to look at on Sunday. And then I'm going to send you our property showing and representation agreement, which says if this agreement is for these specific properties. Now, one of the things that I did in the video is I show how where it lists the 3 properties, instead of listing the 3 properties, if you put on the second line, because it's easier on the second line, just trust me, that see addendum number 1. See addendum number 1, and then I've added a sample addendum, and on the addendum, you could list 4, 5, 6 properties. So if you're going to be showing more than 3 and you want them all included, you would add an addendum, right? And there's a video I've made of me walking through that form as well. Plus, I've gone ahead and prepared a step-by-step guide. This links back to the form we were on about how do you get them signed. And then this is a breakdown of the BRBC form and what every section says, in case you wanted to read it. And then there's also a discussion of what all the other forms are that are included: agency disclosure, the broker compensation advisory, possible representation of more than one, buyer investigation, consumer privacy. Now, the buyer identification of preferences is referred to in the BRBC. If you might want to watch the video of me filling out the BRBC. I could do it again here. I may have time, but I usually don't use this form. This form is a specific list of things the buyer wants. I would prefer to keep that off the BRBC and just ask them questions about what are you looking for and take notes. There's a cancellation form. Now, I've also included a section on scripts. Some of these come from the NAR and some of them come from CAR. And there are these different let's talk, right? And there's a listing consultation script, and here's conversations with the buyer. And you can see that they have, some scripts explaining how this all works. I've also included a folder that has, and none of this should be here. This is let me just move that someplace else, probably. 9 reasons why you need a buyer's agent, settlement resources for buyers and sellers. This is something you could actually share that explains what's going on and that sort of thing, right? This seems like a lot, doesn't it? I've also worked a little bit on the script I would use. So if you're talking to a buyer about buyer doesn't want to pay compensation, buyer is concerned about compensation, we've got enough transactions under our belt so far that we're starting to see that this hasn't been a huge issue. Last week, for those of you that think that this has killed the market, last week, Rod tells me we had 9 offers accepted last week among the team. And if you're wondering, is that good? That's a pretty good number, right? If we did that every month, I'd be happy, right? Especially if they all closed. So I've also been in a position where I've been talking to other team leaders and brokers about what's happening. And so if I were explaining, so how does this compensation thing work? You explain to them that there is a settlement and that the offer of compensation to the cooperating broker can't be stated in the multiple listing service. So the new rules require that we have a buyer representation agreement that is with a buyer before we can show property, which is why we're having this conversation, and that agreement has to specify the amount of compensation I'm going to give if I find you a property and you like the property and you make an offer and the offer is accepted and the transaction closes, then I'm going to be paid. And if the buyer is curious, well, how does that actually work? Well, there are 3 possibilities. And this is sort of summarizing the broker compensation advisory. Number 1 is the buyer could pay me directly. Notice what I wrote. This option rarely occurs. In hundreds of transactions that have happened since the NAR settlement, we have not once seen the buyer directly pay the broker compensation. Not once. Right? Not once. Second option is the seller or builder, right? If it's a new home build, can directly pay the compensation. And that, by the way, is one of the more common examples. And there are many sellers that have said, I want to offer something to an agent who brings a buyer. I want that. I want to incentivize. I want to cooperate. I want to do it. And in fact, I get emails from, it's called Zip Your Flyer and similar services, of new listings, and it says in the subject line 3% commission. You understand? That's legal. It is legal for the listing agent to create a flyer that is emailed to all the realtors in a given county that says the seller is willing to pay a 3% commission. I get them, right? And just because the rules have changed in how it can be communicated doesn't mean the sellers don't want to cooperate. Then the question is, well, what if you and I agree that you're going to get 2.5%, but the seller's not willing to pay 2.5%? What then? My answer would be, if the amount offered is less than the amount we negotiated, we can modify our teams to match, assuming it is within reason. And I have to change within reason. So far, that has happened every time. Because remember, point number one, we haven't had a buyer yet pay the commission directly. That has not happened. We have, on occasions, modified our compensation request to match what the seller says they're willing to pay. And then the other option is that instead of it being a direct pay by the seller to us, that it's negotiated into the offer as a concession. And it's done by a concession, and we see that a lot, right? So far, the most common has been number 3. It's negotiated in the offer. It's paragraph 3G3. Paragraph 3G3 in the residential purchase agreement says that the buyer has a buyer representation agreement and that the seller is going to compensate, give a concession to the buyer to cover the commission to the agent. You see, the discussion of commissions can be in the purchase agreement. I saw in an online forum, somebody was freaking out because in the purchase agreement, the buyer and the buyer's agent directly referred to commission to the buyer and buyer's agent. And the person that was commenting was freaking out because, oh my God, should I turn them in? You know, they're talking about commissions. They're talking about the seller paying the buyer's agent commission. Isn't that illegal, immoral, unethical? And the answer is no, because the purchase agreement is not the MLS. It is a violation of the rules to put it in the MLS. It is not a violation of the rules to put it in a purchase agreement. So paragraph 3G3 of the residential purchase agreement, there's a box you can check, and then it loads a form, SPBB, the seller payment of buyer broker form, where you can write in the amount. Are there any questions so far? Does everybody understand this conversation?
Yes.
Jess, John?
Hey, Michael, regarding the last one, so the seller concessions. So I remember there was a meeting with Jody where she mentioned there's a limitation of what % of seller commissions can be provided in into an offer.
Correct.
So depending on the sale price or something. I don't remember the exact conversation, but that was around that lines.
Right. So that amount, however, which varies depending upon the kind of lender you're using, ranges from a low of 6% to a high of 9%. So even though we have situations where the seller is giving a concession, the seller may be giving a concession for an interest rate buy down. The seller may be giving a concession for repairs. Rarely, I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and I have never seen a seller concession push the maximum. Right? FHA has a maximum concession of 6%. Now you understand that's a huge concession. And Fannie Mae, if it's an owner-occupied 1 to 4 unit, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have a concession limit of 9%. Right, that's a huge amount. So your measly 2.5, right? You understand is easy to work into that. The second option, though, is if you don't do number 3, but you do number 2. Number 2 was a direct payment from the seller to the buyer's broker. Now, EXP actually has a form for this. It's called direct payment to the buyer's broker. And that's why letting myself and our transaction coordinator get involved might be very useful in this, because despite the confusion of the folders, we actually have a pretty good handle on the forms. If the seller is paying directly the buyer broker out of escrow, and it doesn't say in the purchase contract that it's a concession to the buyer and then the buyer pays, you understand that's another step. So paragraph 3 was a concession from the seller to the buyer, and then the buyer gives the money to the buyer's broker. that falls into the concession limits that the lenders have. But if the seller pays directly, it's not part of the concession limits. So you could do that and still have you could, if you do number 2 and EXP has a form for this, then it doesn't even show up in the maximum amount of concessions that are allowed to the buyer because it's not in the contract. You see, number 2 is not a concession to the buyer. So it doesn't fall into the concession limit. It's a direct payment by the seller to the buyer's agent.
I see. Makes sense. Thank you for going on.
So this is not something I would worry about. And if you signed up for Chicago Agent 1 and you're paying the, I don't know, 99 cents a month to get their premium version, they actually have a flyer that is auto-generated based upon price and address that shows you what the concession limits are and dollars amount. In California, we rarely get anywhere close to the concession limits, right? Because they're frankly pretty high. 6 to 9% is a big concession. But if you had a buyer for some reason was already pushing this, then we would include the seller direct payment form and it wouldn't be part of the concession anymore.
Hi, Mike, it's Jody. Can I chime in?
Yes?
Cool. I just wanted to say that obviously you're right on all of that. One of the practices I would implement is that, yeah, you're right.
It's Jody.
Yes, Jody. Hey there. If anyone doesn't know who I am, I'm sorry. I'm Jody Hitano, loan officer with Rocket Mortgage. One of the things I would just be cautious of when you're writing your offers, as long as you specifically say, if you feel like you have to put this in the contract that the seller is going to contribute, X% to the commission, as long as it's not, what we would not want to see is it say, seller will contribute 2.5% to buyer for closing cost, period. Then that's going to have to be added into the interested party contribution limits and all of that. So if it doesn't say it just like that, and it specifically says it's for commission, or you handle it like Mike said, not in the contract, but through the other form, it's not going to be calculated in those limits and nothing really to worry about.
Let me clarify this because we talked about this once before. Right. So there you are. How you doing?
Hello.
So in the BRBC form, and there are 2 sections. One section is paragraph 3G1. But paragraph 3G1 says that this is a concession from the seller to the buyer. It's just a general, and could be used for repairs, closing costs, any of that stuff. And then 3G3 says this is a concession essentially from the seller to compensate the buyer's broker. Now, my original guess or assumption is that the reason that the California Association of Realtors lawyers split those 2 had to do with if the second one is specifically for compensating the buyer's broker, that it would be why am I pulling up this form? If it's specific to the buyer's broker, then it would be separate from the interested party's contribution. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That if there's a 9% limit, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac is its owner occupied, etc., then I thought you had said, and I know some of this is, we're all learning, is that if it's in the contract, then it's considered an interested party contribution. The only way for it not to be would be outside of the contract.
Fannie has not released a letter yet. The most recent one we have is from April that really details this out. But what they have said is that the real estate agent commission is a customary fee. And so customary fees are not included in interested party contribution.
Right.
So at this point, the only thing that would trigger an interested party contribution potential issue is if the contract says something as simple as seller to contribute 2.5% to buyer for closing costs.
Right.
Period.
So
That would be that wording it like that would then trigger that.
right. So 3G1, seller credit to buyer, right? And so if they put in a dollar amount or a percentage, that's obviously interested party contribution, right? If they go to 3G3 and check this box, seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker, and it launches that other form, then that's not an interested party contribution, or we're not sure.
Oh, it's not.
It's not. Okay. So that was my assumption as to why they split it, because otherwise they could, if it's a credit, it doesn't limit in 3G1 what the buyer can use the credit for, right? I mean, you call it what you want, but if it's a credit, right? Which the buyer could say is to compensate. So this is what we've seen all the time. We haven't had the direct payment one, that form, be used yet in one of our transactions. This form is what is checked, right? Since we're talking about paying, this is the seller payment concession for buyer's broker's compensation. And then let's say it was 2.5%. Now, one of the things that I was talking to Raw about, our transaction coordinator, some agents, when they send this to us, include a copy of their BRBC form, right? The buyer representation and broker compensation form that says 2.5%. This form doesn't actually say that you have to give a copy when you give the form. It says if you don't have a form, then there's no obligation to pay. But it doesn't say you have to give them the form. You'll notice it says here in paragraph 3, I can't really highlight, but in paragraph 3, the second line, upon request, the buyer would, and the buyer's agent would have to cough up a copy of the buyer representation agreement and to prove that they really have something with 2.5%. Most of the time, we're getting a copy of the BRBC form that shows the same commission amount that's being asked for here. But just so you realize, that's not exactly a requirement. But if the seller wants to see it because they say prove it, then you have to give them a copy. All right. This is the functional part. So every transaction we've had, every transaction that I've talked to other agents about involves paragraph 3G3. Everything so far has been handled in this paragraph with the seller property and buyer broker agreement form attached, and usually with a copy of the BRBC form attached, just so they don't have to ask. Are there any questions about this? All right. So Jody, how long how much time did you want to talk about the market? Otherwise, I was going to quickly go through a part of the buyer representation. Would 5 minutes be enough?
Oh, no, I don't even think I need that much, probably 30 seconds.
So, well then, can you wait till I just do this?
Absolutely. I'm here till the end of the call, just whenever.
All right. Here, so why don't we, while we're at it, this is the CAR buyer representation package, right? And there's EXP has their own versions of it, but this is what the package would look like. Agency disclosure. Of course, the value of doing this on ZipForms is that you can fill out most of it online, and you could use ZipForms mobile. Here's the agreement. The date does not have to be the date you're meeting with the buyer. It's the date you started the agreement. You would fill, and I made a video of me going through this line by line, which is included in this, so that you could practice if you wanted to. You put in the beginning and end date. Notice it says not to exceed 3 months unless it's a corporation. The default is non-exclusive. Non-exclusive means that the buyer could revoke the agreement anytime they wanted to. It does say that if you've been involved in a property, which means showing them, negotiating, providing information, that they still are obligated to pay you. So if they see a house, you show them a house and they want to make an offer on the house, and then they say, we're firing you because now we want to make an offer with the listing agent, you're still covered under the non-exclusive agreement. You could say exclusive, which means they're not allowed to back out. And the default setting is for 30 days. That might be a harder sell. You would pick property types. You can't just check them all, right? Not if you want this to be enforceable. And you would put in the locations. If you want it, you don't want it to be too broad. You can't say California, all counties in California. That'll make it unenforceable. Additional description, I don't know if they are really saying we don't want to buy anything over 20 years old or something like that. Usually we don't want to write anything. The additional buyer preferences, I refer to that. If you click that box, it asks them a whole bunch of questions about what they want. Now, the problem is it attaches that information to their obligation to pay you anything. And if you sell them something that doesn't match, then they're probably not obligated. Now, properties excluded from representation, how would that occur? Maybe they had a buyer representation agreement already with another broker who's already showed them properties, and they're obligated to pay that broker if they buy one of those properties. You would put those properties here because they're already obligated to pay someone else. The amount of compensation, 2.5%. We see often you could put in 2. You could modify this depending upon the dollar amount. Personally, I don't mind selling a house for $20,000. Mr. Pine has a question.
Yeah, just a quick question. So if you meet someone at an open house and they want to work with you as their buyer's agent, and you sign the forms with them after you showed them at the open house, is that open house covered?
Well, yeah. So what you're supposed to do at the open house is if you look at the CAR open house form and you read the explanation at the top of it, what it's essentially saying is that I represent the seller until our relationship changes and I'm starting to be involved in representing you. So while I'm representing the seller, which is go ahead and take a look at the house, let me know if you have any questions. So you're really not involved in representing them. But so that's covered by the fact that it's an open house. When they say, well, we're interested, can you help us out? Are there any disclosures? Can you give us an idea what the comparables are? Do you know any good lenders? Once that starts, then you would say to them, believe me, I want to help you. I would love to help you. I can do all that for you, but we need to have a buyer representation agreement at this time. So yeah, if you then signed it, then the fact that they've seen that house with you would still be covered.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Amount of compensation, it could be a dollar amount. If you get paid by somebody else, you get credit. 30 days, this is the period of time afterwards that if they go back and buy a property you're involved in showing them, they could, they still owe you. Cancellation, if it's non-exclusive upon receipt, notice you could say 5 days or something like that, so that it gives them, they can't just cancel you and then go back, and buy another house that next day. That's up to you. Exclusive cancellation, it says 30 days. That's a long time to give notice. Is there any way we could shorten that? Yes, we could write something in another terms. We might want them to give personal information right away. We don't normally have them fill out the DFPI, which is the buyer's financial personal information form. My recommendation is before you, if you have the time, before you have a formal consultation, you have them talk to Jody, have them talk to a loan agent, and you get the loan agent to tell you whether or not they can afford to buy a house. We haven't had any cases where we're checking these boxes. Buyer does not have sufficient funds, doesn't matter, we're going to get the seller to pay. Buyer intends to use a loan product where they can't compensate the broker. Go ahead and check the box. I mean, VA, I think they changed that rule, but that's, not, we're going to have the seller pay. Then I'm going to let Jody, she can address the VA thing and talk about her market update. But I just want to say one thing about this from a very practical point of view. Getting somebody to sign a contract doesn't get you any money. If the buyer buys the property and you want to sue them, you need to understand that you as a real estate salesperson can't sue them. You can't. Only your broker can. Now, just because you got somebody to sign something like an exclusive agreement, and then they go buy a property that you did not show them, that you didn't give them any information, you didn't help them negotiate, they just go and buy the property. The idea that you're going to be able to take them to court and win and make them pay you a commission is a really remote possibility, right? It's not going to happen, right? And you could say, well, I got them to sign the agreement and then they bought without me and I want to collect. That the chances that a judge or jury would ever award you that commission is virtually non-existent, right? The only cases that I've ever seen where a buyer-broker agreement was enforced in that way is when the agent had been involved in negotiating in the transaction. They had some involvement. And you would have to convince your broker to do this. So I see agents that are all concerned about, the wording and all that. How about this? If you do a good job representing them as a buyer's agent, they're not going to want to work with anyone else. And you're going to get paid. But getting them to sign a contract that is actually unfair to them, your broker is probably not going to hire a lawyer and sue. If the lawyer is probably going to say, we're never going to win this. Why are we doing this? And if you could overcome those obstacles, the chances of collecting money are very, very slim. That's my opinion. Okay, Jody.
All right. Awesome. Thanks for letting me pop on here at the end. Just wanted to give you guys a quick little market update. I'm sure you've seen it in the news. I know my phone's ringing off the hook. Yes, interest rates are going down. They've gone down every day this week or the past week for about 6 days and had another drop this morning. Fed definitely going to be reducing by a quarter. There's now talk that the 50 basis point reduction is, the high probability. Don't know that yet, but the reason rates are going down now, obviously, is because the market's already reacting to the quarter cut because we know that's happening. It's 100% certainty. So that's already built in. If we see them drop a half, then you're going to probably see a little bit of a market reaction. But the jobs report is fueling this. Inflation numbers are fueling this recent drop. I am reaching out to a lot of people, even some of you guys that I've closed before, saying, hey, I think we're getting close to time to refinance. So I just wanted to put that bug in your ear. If you have closed someone in the last, say, year and a half, 2 years, and maybe they didn't close with me, but another lender, please give them a call and say, hey, let's talk with Jody. I have no lender fee. So the closing costs will be pretty minimal. And in a lot of cases, I can cover them. I'm not talking about adding it to the loan balance like most lenders do. I'm talking about me truly covering the cost. So reach out to your past clients. It's always a good time to say hello anyway. Hey, how you doing? Y'all moved in, having a great time in your new home. Do you know anybody that's, looking to purchase? Rates are coming down. Also, let's give Jody a call, see if she can help you out from, before. I'm happy to do a quick mortgage checkup with people to see if it's a possibility. Anytime we can save them money, it's going to make them happier. And it's also going to look really good on you because you're, continuing to show them that you're a valuable asset in their lives, putting them in touch with someone like me who can help save them money. If you guys need anything, of course, I'm around 24/7. It feels like you've got my cell number. I can put it in the chat again here. What we're anticipating is that rates will continue to drop even after the Fed meet. Although, you know, it does kind of do a little bit of a roller coaster, but we've got this nice drop here for about 6 days in a row. Want to take advantage of it. So let me know how I can be of service to you all. Thank you so much, Mike, for letting me pop on real quick and give an update.
All right, thank you. Let me just answer a couple of questions that came in the chat. I have seen an open house flyer that says 3% commission to the buyer's agent. The answer is yes, that's legal. It just can't be in the MLS. It can be in flyers. It could be on the sign. It could be a writer on the sign. It could be mentioned at the board meetings. How and when do you explain or cover to buyers the closing costs while talking about the purchase agreement? That's a good question. I use the Chicago Agent One, which is an app that would estimate closing costs for a particular property. So at the time that we're writing an offer, I would go through that with them. And if they've talked to Jody, they may already have heard about that. But we would do that when we're discussing how much to offer, and I would show them. This is like yes, Jody answered that question. They're asking for your contact information, Jody. If you could type that in, I could, if you have it handy. Yes. All right, give me. How about that? I have it handy. Jody's probably happy to hear that. General rule of thumb for refi. Anyhow, any more Jody questions? I put in her contact information. Reach out to Jody directly. You got her phone number, you got her NMLS number, you got her email. All right, are we good? Any last burning questions before we go? All right, thank you. Bye.